Hello, everyone, and welcome to the closing session of the 2022 RFS annual virtual meeting. We've entitled this session Center Stage, Science and Leadership from Bench to Boardroom. And I'm delighted to be joined by a trio of fantastic guests who I will introduce in just a couple of minutes. First, let me introduce myself. I'm Kevin Davis. I'm the executive editor of two of the many 100-plus journals published by Marianne Liebert. Those are the CRISPR Journal, launched in 2018, and more recently, Gen Biotechnology, a marquee multidisciplinary biotech journal launched in 2022 that we have very high hopes for. And you can find out more about that journal at www.genbiotechjournal.com. And if you're publishing research, we hope you will certainly take a good look at what Gen Biotech has to offer under the editorship of a fantastic female scientist, Professor Hannah El Samad. I'm also the author of Editing Humanity, The CRISPR Revolution, and the New Era of Genome Editing, available in paperback, ebook, and audiobook. Well, as I mentioned today, for this session, I'm thrilled to be joined by a trio of outstanding scientists. We'll be joined a bit later by Rita Colwell, the president of RFS, and I'll say more about her later. But for now, I'm thrilled to welcome the two guests on screen. First of all, Dorothea Verbrugge, who is Vice President of Clinical Quality at Aetna. She has oversight of Aetna's Clinical Policy Unit Team and Physician Liaison Program, among many others. Previously an executive at Intermountain Healthcare and Altius Health Plans, board certified family physician, and she's practiced as a family physician in Utah. She joins us from Salt Lake City. Hi, Dot.
Hi, thank you.
Great to see you. And we're also joined by Brandye Michaels, who is Senior Director of Analytical R&D and Microbiology Strategy and Testing for Pfizer, where she leads Pfizer's global microbiology strategy and testing team, devising microbiological strategies to ensure safety of clinical trial therapeutics and manufacturing facility quality control. So we have a lot to talk to her very much. She's been very busy over the last few years, no doubt. She's active on numerous boards and associations and has previous industry experience at Lonza Biologics and Wyeth. She's a microbiologist by training. Hi, Brandye. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, thanks for having me.
And speaking of microbiologists, we'll be joined shortly by Rita Colwell, who, of course, as most of you know, is the president of the Rosalind Franklin Society and a thoroughly distinguished scientist with numerous accolades to her name. And also she's the author of a great book called A Lab of One's Own, One Woman's Personal Journey Through Sexism in Science. So we'll talk to Rita a little bit later. So the title of our discussion, or the theme of our discussion, is Science and Leadership from Bench to Boardroom. And so I'm thrilled to have Dot and Brandye with us. So let's just sort of get warmed up. Dot, I'll start with you. Can you maybe just embellish a little? I give you the brief sort of nuggets of your resume. Tell us a little bit about some of the highlights of your own research career and the journey that has brought you to this important position at Aetna.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And I'm actually going to start with how I got into science to begin with, because when I started college, I said I was never going to take another science class again. In high school, I had been pegged for the Science Olympiad every year, and I was like, there's no way I'm going to do that with the group, of all boys that was doing that. And so, but I always had this science aptitude. So when I got to college, I ended up playing college soccer. I got injured and I became really intrigued with what was going on in the training room, actually, in the at the college level. And so I became interested in athletic training and then physical therapy. And then I said, well, I guess if I'm going to do this, I'm going to go into science. And if I'm going to go into science, I may as well be a physician in healthcare. So that was kind of my journey into science. And went to medical school. And I'll say that very few people go to medical school thinking someday they're going to be an insurance administrator. Yet life happened. And after 5 years of clinical practice as a family physician, I became, I started dabbling in insurance, applying clinical evidence to coverage determinations. And I actually found that to be really interesting because I was on the cutting edge and learning about all these new technologies. And now in my career, 20 years later, I find myself as Vice President of Clinical Quality, having worked up through all of the areas of health insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, commercial insurance, and have a unique role here at Aetna, which is owned by CVS Health, where I oversee the clinical policy development team, where we apply evidence to coverage decisions. I oversee a small team of analysts in my clinical insight and analytics team. And then we've also recently just launched a clinical evidence development team, which is hoping to put out, and is already in the short 6 months that it's been here, has put out publications using CVS Health Aetna data to show how we can impact the quintuple aim of health outcomes, costs, member experience, provider experience, and health equity. We've touched on all those areas in our publications in just the last 6 months since that team has launched. So it's an exciting time, and that's it in a nutshell. Thank you.
That's great. That's great. Brandye, let me ask you the same, to tell us about your personal journey to this important role that you have at Pfizer.
Yes, if I were to ask my 18-year-old self, would I be doing this job? The answer would be no. I was very, very career-driven from a young age. Nobody in my family had gone to college before, so I didn't have a lot of help financially or navigating the path to college, how to do it. I remember a class that I took in high school was anatomy and physiology, and it was the first time something really clicked. And that right there, then and there, I knew there was something with science that I was very attracted to.
Yeah.
And I remember going to the public library and sitting down and looking through career books and saying, okay, I've got to find a job. I want to go to school. I want to make a certain amount of money. I have to be independent. What am I going to do? And so at the time, this was many decades ago, I looked through a lot of the biological science, a lot of the nursing careers, medical, that sort of thing came up. So I decided to study biology. I did my bachelor's degree. When I finished that, I took a year off because I was trying to decide what was next. There's not much you can do with just a biology degree. Deciding whether to go to medical school or to veterinary school, it was very much a financial decision for me. And so I took a temp job by chance while I was kind of navigating, what I was going to do next. And the temp position put me in a laboratory at Lonza Biologics. At that point, this was back in the, early 2000s, late 90s, and I had never heard of a biotech company. Nobody had told me pharmaceuticals were a possible career. I didn't know this existed. And so, here I was in a lab, and I knew that what I was doing was part of something bigger, but I didn't know what. I was a doer, doing the science, doing the testing, and right away I knew that wasn't enough. And so, okay, I need to do my PhD. There's more to this. And again, I was very independent, trying to figure out how I could work and do this. And ultimately, I did decide to apply for the PhD, and they had the stipend and so on that would help. And when I went to talk to the advisors on, what I wanted to study and what I wanted to do, pretty much every professor didn't want much to do with me, having been in industry and being very upfront that that's what I want to go back to. And there was one professor who did end up being my advisor. And it turned out his wife actually was in the pharmaceutical industry, the biotech industry, and he was very comfortable and admired what she did. And so he opened me, welcome, and it was the best thing that he was the best advisor I could have asked for. So he knew from the beginning that I would not be a part of his legacy, that I would move on. Again, I was very driven, very focused. I had goals. I wanted to finish it quickly. I did my PhD very quickly, and I had a colleague at Wyeth who had also just completed her PhD, and she said, hey, there's this job opening, and it literally sounds like it is written for you. And I read it, and it was, this is everything I know. I can do this. I'm the perfect, but I wasn't finished yet. So, this was in the summer. So the following year was when I needed to write, my thesis. And somehow I negotiated Wyeth to hire me. And I would work 20 hours a week while I finished writing my thesis. And then I would go back and graduate, and then it would be full time because I didn't want to lose that position. And surprisingly, they agreed. And so that worked out well. I got that position. I loved it immediately. And very soon after that, what happens as you grow in management and leadership roles, you then start leaving the lab. And that's always a little bit of a self-reflection. Do I not want to touch a pipette ever again? I loved it. This is where I got my spark in leadership and loving managing groups. And at that time, I made one more move over to the R&D side, where we make clinical trial medicines. And even in my personal life, that's where things clicked, where I realized, okay, these medicines for these clinical trials, there are people literally waiting, like down to the hour, down to the day for these oncology clinical trials. These are their last hope, therapy. And I had a personal experience with that in my family. And then the COVID vaccine was pretty much the icing on the cake. Like, okay, I have an impact. This is where I belong. And that's where I've been for about 10 years now.
I hope we have time to talk about some of your experiences and insights from your work on the COVID story a little bit later in our discussion. We've been joined by our third guest, Rita Colwell. So I want to bring her on. Rita is the Distinguished University Professor at the University of Maryland and Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She's the founder and chairperson of CosmosID, a biotech company that seeks to unlock the microbiome. Her interests are very much in global infectious diseases, water health. She's the 11th and first female director of the National Science Foundation, former president of AAAS, recipient of the National Medal of Science, and has the rare distinction of having a geological site in Antarctica named after her. And as I mentioned earlier, she's the author of A Lab of One's Own, and she's the president of the Rosalind Franklin Society. Deep breath. Hello, Rita. Thank you for joining us.
I'm delighted. I'm glad I was able to overcome the computer glitches to join you. So
what would a Zoom virtual conference be without somebody having a computer glitch? I don't know how you can, in a few minutes, sum up your incredible career journey, but would you like to try?
Well, I must say that I didn't plan as a child to do what I have done, but it's been really a set of circumstances, really, of having the appropriate mentors, the good mentors, having married a wonderful guy who was very supportive throughout our entire marriage, and being able, I think, to take advantage of opportunities. I think probably what would be interesting for me just to say, how did I come to start CosmosID? And that was because when I was director of the National Science Foundation, it was during the 9/11 terrible incident in attack in New York. And it was followed by the anthrax biothreat incident. And I ran an interagency committee for 5 years that tracked down the source of the material used by the perpetrator. It took 5 years, and being a systematist, evolutionary microbiologist, it struck me that I could develop algorithms that could rapidly identify all microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, fungus, protists in a given system. This was successful. I did develop the algorithm, and I thought, well, this was going to be difficult to start an endeavor through funding by the federal government because it would require significant amounts of money, $5 or $6 million. Fortunately, there was an angel investor friend who had the finances and was very keen on what I was planning to do, and financed the launch of CosmosID. So that was in 2007, and we formally formed a company in 2008. And it has prospered over the years to the point now where it's quite successful. And it is focused on rapid identification of microorganisms, really down to strain, and being able to determine the genetic composition. So this has application in medicine, food technology, the environment, etc. So it was really taking advantage of an opportunity at a time when it was possible to develop a company, and fortunately being successful on the one hand, but on the other, it introduced me to the vicissitudes of being a woman in business. Very difficult. It turns out that there is shall we say, an excess of testosterone in the environment when one starts a company. Hence, there were many trials and tribulations, but success did prevail. That's just a little bit of a background.
Well, that's the perfect segue to this next question, and I'll come back to you, Dot, and let you go first. I'm curious, and I hope the viewers are curious, what you think about whether the corporate world is a hospitable environment for women and also underrepresented minorities in science. I'm curious if you think we're making progress. What steps are you seeing, or would you like to see, to make it a more hospitable environment?
It is changing, but the system is still there. And I think the Me Too movement was very beneficial because it empowered women to speak up, speak out, and to remedy, or at least to work together to remedy the imbalances and the imperfections. I think what's really very valuable is for women to coalesce, to what I call form a posse, and that is to have like-minded individuals with whom you meet. For example, the Women in Bio organization and the Rosalind Franklin Society is a mechanism that has proven, I think, very valuable in bringing together women to discuss the issues and the problems, and to understand that it's not us, it's the system that's difficult and interfering with success. But it is changing, mainly because the world recognizes, I think, that 50% of the brains, actually it's more like 52%, because women tend to survive a little stronger, and that you don't fight an army with just half your militia. You need the whole militia. So I think that understanding is prevailing.
Dot, how have your experiences been?
Yeah, I think it's highly dependent on the company itself. The company culture is extremely important. CVS Health is CEO right now is Karen Lynch. And of course, she's been a great role model for many. And the culture of the company at this point is to really try to have leadership and our employee workforce represent the population. And that would include race, ethnicity, gender, LGBTQ, and to hire for full representation. And that is very clear from the top levels all the way down that is an objective. For our, as a payer with Aetna, for our provider groups, we are working toward incentivizing reporting on race, ethnicity, gender mix, and trying to move the needle across the country in those areas. I worked for companies where that has not been a priority. And there's definitely a difference in sitting at the table in a boardroom in those companies versus the companies that don't. And it really is a culture that starts at the top and then has to trickle down all the way down in order to improve the ratios and allow the leadership and colleagues to represent the population itself. I'll also say that in medicine particularly, we have seen previously, it was always men, the white doctor, the white male doctor was the predominant role that you would see. When I went to Case Western Reserve Medical School, it was the very first class where we had 51% women. And for better or worse, that was quite a few years ago, and they've continued to try to balance that. And I think most medical schools are moving in that direction too, if they haven't already gotten there, with a fairly balanced ratio coming in at this point in time. And everybody sees that healthcare, we do better when we see people who we believe understand us. And often that means having that ratio balanced.
You're painting quite a rosy picture. Are there any issues or concerns or problems that you think where either your current employer or just the industry more generally could still do a better job?
Absolutely. We aren't there yet.
Okay. I
guess I've painted the picture of where we hope to go and the things that are put in place. If you recall, I started off saying there was no way I was going to do the science Olympiad when I was in high school because I was not going to hang out with those boys. It is changing, but I've still been in boardrooms as well where I'm the only woman in the room. Having a voice in that situation is more difficult. So we aren't there yet. At the same time, there's a sustained effort, I think, across the country. If you see what's coming out in the clinical literature and scientific literature, it's more sustained than it has been before to measure the differences in health equity from a gender and race ethnicity standpoint. And there have been nudges in this direction before, but it feels bigger this time.
Brandye, tell us about your experience and what you think perhaps is going well and what could be done better.
I think it's evolved a lot. I was young when I first started my career, and I think the biggest difference is everything is more visible now. Early on, I had strong women. My first two bosses were very strong women. At Wyeth, my very first job, I had great role models. Early on, I do remember those feelings of being in a room and kind of looking around, well, wow, I am the only woman here. But where I think things really changed and what I think is so important is exactly what Dot said, and it comes down to the company culture and the leadership. I think it's very difficult to make a blanket statement about corporate. I can speak for Pfizer, and I know for Pfizer, it's a top priority because everything is very, in this sort of company, very structured, very visible. We have things like our core values, and one of those is equity. And you are thinking about equity every single day. Mm-hmm. It's your goals are written around equity. You're rewarded for equity. It's, very structured to get the message out there. And I noticed a big difference when we got our new CEO, who is actually a Greek immigrant. And right away, I noticed, with such a big company, you don't often see the impact of a CEO trickle down as far as we did with Albert. But, one of the first things was maternity leave, 6 months, which was fully paid, which I remember when I had my maternity leave, I think it was 6 weeks. So to have 6 months, 3 months paternity leave, all kinds of things he did to help, working moms with caregiver days, soft things like that. I think it just comes down to what's important to those leaders and what's passed down. And I think it's just much more visible, with social media. It's there's more metrics around it. So it's being talked about, which before I don't think it was.
Rita, I want to sort of flip this question around and talk a little bit about academia, because it seems that in the last few years, the pendulum is swung kind of away from sort of the freedom and the joy of unfettered basic research in academia, as we see. I don't have numbers here, but the distinct perception that industry is looming much more attractive for young students and postdocs, that maybe the stresses of completing a PhD, the duration, the discrimination that unfortunately is still all too common in different sections of academia, or just practical issues. I mean, students literally unable to afford childcare in cities like San Francisco and Boston and New York because their stipends simply don't even cover the cost of that, plus rent. So you still have a foot or two in academia. How do you see the situation there?
It's very interesting. I think, first of all, it's still important to obtain a PhD because that provides you with leadership capabilities, the training, the background, the knowledge. So it's not a matter of either or with respect to further education. It's just that the opportunities are much greater. And the difficulties, I think academia is probably not progressing as fast as it ought to, in the sense that there are women who are increasing percentage of the lower ranked faculty, the assistant professors, the lecturers, the associate professors. It's getting a little better to full professor, but when it comes to deans and boards, etc., it tends to be nominal. You know, we're still sort of around one appointment of a woman or one appointment of an African American is set to solve, quote, the problem. Well, first of all, it isn't a problem with respect to the minorities. It's a problem with respect to the system. But I think it's been shown that if you have two or three, at least three individuals of an underrepresented minority, you get better representation. And with respect to industry, it's been shown that you actually have greater profits, because when you have diversity, that's strong diversity, not just nominal diversity, you get better understanding of the market. So with respect to industry being more dominant, I think it's the recognition that for competitiveness, the country really needs to take advantage of the translational research. That is, the research that can be translated to products, that can be translated to application and patentability, which keeps it within the country and strengthens further the industrial capacity of the country. I'm hoping that we don't go too far in that direction, because right now we're still fighting to get Congress to fund the National Science Foundation effectively. There was a lot of, let's say, publicity and discussion about doubling the NSF budget. Well, what's happened is that the budget for that particular legislation went to other entities, the Department of Energy, et cetera, when in fact the NSF budget still needs to be doubled. And basic research is absolutely fundamental. And I think what is not understood either by Congress or lay people is that you don't, as when I was testifying in Congress before the authorization committee for my budget, I was asked by the chairman of an authorization committee, his name shall remain unsighted, asked me, Dr. Colwell, you're getting all this money. How many discoveries are you going to make next year? Well, that indicates a lack of understanding that often it may take 20 years before the application comes through. But then you have tremendous applications like the tracking of flights into and out of airports, the application of an astronomy development in lens manufacture that ended up with laser surgery. Well, in the human eye, well, that took 20, 25 years. So I think we need to balance the investment in the industrial application with the fundamental basic research, which feeds the applications. And so I think it's been good, but I think we need to temper it to ensure that we do have a future.
Yes. Yes, great. Thank you. We titled this session Science and Leadership, and I'd like to talk about leadership for a few minutes. We love to talk about leadership, don't we? As if that's what everyone should aspire to. It's the pinnacle of professional success. And you've all enjoyed elements of tremendous success in your own specific fields and industries. Did that come naturally to you, or did you really have to work on parts of your character or your team building in order to reach those levels? And I also wonder, should everyone be aspiring to be a better leader, or is it okay if you don't want to be a leader? Dot, let me start with you.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think this is a bigger challenge for women than it is for men in general. We all have that feeling at some point that, wow, if I was a man, they wouldn't have asked me that question, or they wouldn't have made that assumption based on what I've said. And I've had multiple areas in leadership specifically where assumptions have been made when you ask someone to do something that you're just a demanding, you can put your own word in there, versus, a reasonable request as a leader. And so balancing that or navigating that fine line between too much and too little, being too friendly and too tough, I think is a very narrow line for women compared to what the assumptions that are made for a male in that same situation. So some of the coaching and executive leadership training that I've had have been extremely helpful in that area. And so there are formal techniques you can learn to mitigate that, and that has been very helpful. I will say there are natural leadership skills where you are willing and naturally kind of take charge. But then how you lead your people should be a very deliberate attempt to balance the needs of the company with the needs of your people with the goals that you're trying to obtain. And some formal instruction, training, guidance in that has been very helpful for me. Okay,
that's good to hear. Brandye, how about you? You've achieved great success in your team at Pfizer, but did you had to work on your quote unquote leadership skills in order to achieve that success? And what are some of the advice that you would give for people who are coming up behind you?
Yes, definitely. So I think one of the biggest mistakes we sometimes make in the industry is assuming that an excellent scientist is going to be an excellent leader. And that is not often the case. And so there are obviously positions within the company where they're not people management roles. Maybe they're project management roles, they're independent contributors. So I think we've learned that. And I do think there is some natural ability in people to lead. And we do the trainings, there's formal trainings at work externally. But I really think a lot of it is trial and error. Every boss I've had many, taken things from each of them that I admired. Some of the very worst bosses that I have had were blessings in disguise. In hindsight, I knew not to be that type of leader. So, and we are given constant feedback. Again, part of the corporate culture is it's very structured, and every 6 months there is a leadership survey that is sent to your colleagues, to your peers, to your direct reports, and you are constantly getting feedback on how you are as a leader. And I would say, as much as I love it, the challenging part is there will never be a finish line. There will never be like, yes, I accomplished this, because you have to work at it every day and the end of your career, you will never be the perfect leader, and there's just always more to learn.
So over the years, you've had some positive, or maybe it's been kind of critical feedback from people that you work with, peers or reports, that you feel you've learned. It may have been stuff that you didn't want to hear, but you've reacted and improved your leadership and managerial skills as a result of some of that feedback.
Yes, and that self-awareness is really key. And there are people I think would be excellent leaders, but they don't have that self-awareness. They're not willing to hear that criticism, even if maybe it's not true, it's a perception, the soft skills. So you really need to have that self-awareness to hear it and work on those things. For sure.
And I'll just add to that too, Brandye. I think that's a great point. The other piece of that is, when we receive feedback, to be sure to be gracious about that. I think we've all probably had some feedback as women in leadership where you're like, ooh, ouch. At the same time, when someone gives you that feedback, it's been very important for me, at least, to step back and say, wow, I need to be grateful that this person told me this, and I need to use this information to make myself better. And that's been a huge asset to approach things that way. And something was much more difficult when I was younger. And as you become a little bit more seasoned, it's an important step in growth.
That's great. Rita, you've assumed positions of tremendous leadership. Did that just come naturally to you, or were there parts of your work, your personality, your managerial approach that you've had to work on over the years?
Well, that's interesting. I've been listening and thinking. I seem always to end up the chairman or the leader or whatever, from grade school to high school to college. And when I'm in organizations, I end up president. And it's not because I aspire to it, it's just that I get elected. And I think it's because of two things. Having a sense of humor helps.
Yeah. And
if you can address really what seem to be intractable problems with a sense of humor as appropriate, this helps. Secondly, I think making sure everyone speaks up. I find that chairing any meeting, I make sure that every person attending speaks at some point, and then the consensus can be brought to a motion and action taken. What I really find distressing is when I'm in a meeting, which I'm not chairing, and we come to a conclusion, and then someone decides, oh, well, we want to rediscuss it. I'm thinking, wait a minute, that's just a waste of time. So by making sure that everybody's included, making sure there's a sense of everybody having a participatory role to play, and ensuring that humor and not anger or distrust or whatever overcomes the discussion, I think really is how it works.
I think those managerial classes you had in grade school, Rita, obviously worked very well for you.
And I've enjoyed it. That's the other thing. It's been fun.
We've got about 10 minutes left. I want to talk about the really the sort of the mission of the Rosalind Franklin Society is to empower women in science. And a big part of that, there's this sort of cycle every year, right? Every October where we wait with bated breath for the Nobel Prizes. And just a couple of months ago, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was shared by 3 tremendously gifted scientists, including Carolyn Bertozzi, the Stanford chemist, who was a very high-profile, passionate advocate of open access and LGBTQ rights. And a couple of years ago, we remember Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuelle Charpentier sharing for the first time, 2 women sharing the chemistry Nobel Prize. And that's got many commentators extremely excited. But then in between, and in most years around it, the prize, the demographic settles back to its usual pattern of all male, mostly white recipients. So are these efforts to boost women in science, how can we make them a priority and not just window dressing?
there's two pieces to that. Number one is that you don't want to put people in positions that they cannot handle. So there's a lot of mentoring that has to happen to those who are in the pipeline, and that has to be deliberate. So I think that's the first part, is being sure that we feed the pipeline, and exactly as you're doing now with these efforts here to ensure that the those who have shown those leadership abilities and may need a little bit of additional training or nudges to move forward is probably the first piece of that. And then secondly, coaching to be willing to take risks, I think is also important. We all sometimes hear about the difference between confidence and competence, right? And so I think sometimes women struggle a little bit more with the confidence piece, even though they may be more competent. And so putting yourself out there, realizing that, okay, I might not have everything figured out, but I know something here that I can really contribute. So being willing to do that internally, in addition to receiving the mentoring, are two pieces that are incredibly important, and a major piece of the great work that's going on here.
Yeah. Brandye, do you think that how can we use the positive publicity of albeit rather rare, when great female scientists win these incredibly famous prizes? How can we build on that?
Oh gosh, well, I know at Pfizer we do have teams in place, and we have metrics in place in terms of equity in not just the candidates that we're interviewing, but even the interview panel itself. And so we also will go to colleges that we know are historically underrepresented. We're pretty active in job fairs. We have many resource groups. We have a women's resource group, Asian Alliance group. So there's all these communities within Pfizer. So the resources for people that are colleagues, and they also help with recruiting as well. So I think it starts with your strategy with recruiting. And again, I think it comes down to the leaders and, are they walking the talk? Again, speaking for Pfizer, our CEO has said that, within 3 years, he will have 47% of his board will be women. So we want to see that and hold him to that. So I think, again, with corporate, there's more metrics and measurable things and actions that we can take.
Yeah.
And monitor. So
yeah, Rita, you obviously cheer on when a microbiologist like Charpentier wins the Nobel Prize.
Yes.
But do you think we've sustained the positive, the good feelings that we had 2 years ago?
Oh, I'd like to say that it takes work.
Yeah.
These things just don't happen. It's a lot of work to nominate, and that's something that I've spent a lot of time doing. I'm very proud of the fact that 5 of my graduate students, former graduate students, are now members of the National Academy of Science. But it takes a lot of support. It takes just writing up nominations takes time. Sometimes I may be spending a day a week just filling out nominations and writing letters of recommendation. But that's how it's done. And that's why I think the Rosalind Franklin Society plays a major role in that. Karla and certainly our founder, Marianne, have been splendid in making the effort to make sure that women are nominated for the prizes. It doesn't happen automatically. It happens because people step up and say, look, this is a person that really deserves to be recognized. And you fill out the forms, you get the letters, compile the pile of letters of recommendation, et cetera, and then you can sit back and just enjoy the success of the individual whom has the wherewithal to be recognized, gets recognized. So I think that's, again, probably part of the leadership.
Well, the COVID experience over the last 3 years now has certainly brought to light the spectacular work of female scientists who helped develop the RNA vaccine methodology and co-founded companies like BioNTech, the partner with Pfizer. And Brandye, before we close up here, I just want to give you a minute to kind of share what has the experience been like working really at sort of the front lines of COVID vaccine development in your role over the last couple of years?
Well, it was definitely the chance of a lifetime for sure. It was really interesting we're such a large company, and we all had to come together. And, I remember Albert, the CEO, like he was at home with a, video camera. His wife was like doing dishes in the back. Everybody's in lockdown. And, the message was that we're going to do this. We have no choice. Like mankind is waiting on us. Nobody else has the capacity. It's on us. And so it was all hands on deck. We had to prioritize everything else and that we were manufacturing for clinical trials. A lot of the trials had to be paused. There were a lot of things put in place to cut the red tape. Money, if you needed money, you had it. There was no red tape to get the money. There was no red tape to get decisions. Let people make the decision, cut everything out, make it simpler. Things were done in parallel. Medicines usually move in a very linear fashion. You're at a certain phase, you do a small clinical trial, you move on, you write this document, and so on. Everything was done in parallel, just ghostwriting, preparing. And so it was incredible. And it's interesting because I know our experience with the pandemic and my family too is so different from everybody else. I remember hearing friends like, oh, I'm so bored. I don't know what to do. And it was, lockdown was the most stressful time of my life. I was working, 12 hours a day, nonstop. We had over 150 countries to get approval. Audits with Japan are at midnight. It was not a relaxing time. So, we were dealing with the stress of homeschooling, dealing with the same stress of the pandemic as everybody else, but also trying to fix it.
Yeah.
It was an amazing experience. I'm so proud to have been a part of it. And, it's the one thing my family finally understands what I do. My son is very proud. My mom saw it on the news. So it was, I wouldn't say it was fun, but I'm so glad I experienced it.
Well, thank you on behalf of everyone for all the work. Yes, Rita, go ahead.
I'm just going to say kudos, Brandye. Well done. Well done.
Yes, great. Indeed. Well, I just want to give you some time for a minute each for some closing thoughts. I wonder, as you kind of look back over your career and what we've been talking about today, maybe you'd like to share just an anecdote about who you would consider your best mentor and why, or words of advice that you might give to your younger self, knowing what you know now, but you didn't know back then. Dot, start with you.
Yeah, I would say take a chance. Every time there's a decision point, it's easy to go with what's safe and familiar. In many ways, that's natural. At the same time, big things don't happen unless you make big choices. And know that you've got a backing. There's very, very few of us who can say we got where we are by ourselves. All of us work with an incredible support system, and that allows for big choices to be made, even when it doesn't feel safe, but they're worth it.
Brandye.
Yes, I think I agree. I think it would be difficult to pick just one mentor, that had the greatest impact. I've had so many, you will have so many mentors over your career. Sometimes they are a formal mentorship where you were matched with somebody. Sometimes it's a more organic mentorship. Sometimes it's a friend. Sometimes it's a boss that ends up feeling more like a mentor. And I feel like every one of them has left an imprint on me. And I'm kind of a combination of all those interactions. And I think something else, and I mentee women as well. And I think back, sometimes there's one sentence, that just you will remember. I remember that will have such a big impact and you won't realize it. I mean, thinking back to when I was trying to decide if I would do my PhD or not, and I was talking to my friend who was doing her PhD, and I was like, again, I don't know how I can afford it. I'm going to have to take maybe some loans out. And she said, invest in yourself. If you're going to spend any money, invest in yourself. And I clicked, and that was it. And so, and I went, and, it seems silly. And, maybe I still would have gone if it hadn't been for her comment. But now, 30 years later, I'm thinking back and I still remember that statement. It still sticks with me. And that's happened along the way. And there's been so many women, that have been role models. One of my first bosses at Wyeth, when she was interviewing me, she was pregnant and had 2 children at home, and her husband was a stay-at-home dad. And I said, yes, that was the first time it's possible. That was the first time I had seen that. So yeah, I would say, and your network, your visibility is very important. You have to put yourself out there, sell yourself, let people know what you're doing. Visibility and network is really important.
Well, we'll give the last word to Rita.
Well, Brandye says it so very well. Let me just say that don't let obstacles thwart your successful path. Find a way around every obstacle, whether it's over, under, around, whatever. So persevere. I would say that also for me, the mentors were my father, who believed that women and men should be educated. His sons and his daughters were encouraged to go on to university. And this was at a time when that wasn't necessarily the rule. And then I have to say that my mentor at the University of Washington, Dr. John Liston, was a Scotsman and iconoclast. He said every rule was made to be broken. Well, to a certain degree, but he was inspiring. And then I have to say that marry the right guy, which I did. My late husband was incredible, a scientist, a sportsman, a fantastic sailor. He and I raced sailboats, and that's another point. Have a holistic life, not just a very narrow focused life, and live it to the fullest. And so I'm fortunate in that I was able to have wonderful children and a life with my husband that was really full. So I've been very lucky, and I think to be a scientist, to be a woman scientist, may have its obstacles, but boy, it sure is a great life.
That's wonderful words to close this session and indeed close the conference. So I would just like to thank our 3 guests today, Dot Verbrugge from Aetna. Thank you, Jot, for joining us. Brandye Michaels, all the way up in Maine today, who's been doing fantastic work with her team at Pfizer. And of course, the RFS president, Rita Colwell. Thank you all. That closes our session on science and leadership from bench to boardroom. Thanks to everyone for their wonderful insights and humor and advice for everyone watching. I'm Kevin Davis. That closes this final session of the conference. And I invite you to stay tuned for some closing remarks from Karla.
Thank you all for joining us for these past 2 days of presentations and interviews. They will be available on demand on our website in case you missed any or want to share them with your colleagues. One of our important messages continues to be that women and minorities have options in academia, in industry, and in the public sector. We have tried to showcase all 3. And we have also tried to showcase some optimism in all 3. Several incredible appointments in Washington, including at the FDA, at NCI, OSTP, and heading the new Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, ARPA-H. Incredible leadership in the recent discoveries of COVID-19 vaccines and new drug discoveries every day. And brazen and brilliant young women launching biotech startups with children and a spouse in tow. But we are certainly not done. A detailed report earlier this year by AAUW documented that only 22% of the 130 R1 universities are led by women. And while 40% of all academic deans and provosts, from which 75% of all presidents are drawn, only 10% of all university system presidents are women. Among those university presidents, only 5% are women of color. And half of these research universities have never had a woman president. Not long ago, the prestigious positions of president at Harvard, Princeton, and MIT were all women. They are all gone. But a shining light is the recent appointment of Dr. Sally Kornbluth, a microbiologist and provost at Duke, to become the next president of MIT in January 2023. She, of course, is in our sights for RFS. So please continue to read our biweekly RFS briefings, continue to follow us on social media and our website, and make sure to let us know what you and your colleagues are doing. With thanks to all of you, I am Karla Shepard Rubinger, Executive Director of the Rosalind Franklin Society, and wishing you all happy and healthy holidays. Thanks.